Hey everyone out there, Dan here from Geekcast Radio, doing another graphic thoughts video. This is where I go through some of the recent graphic novels I've been reading, give you my thoughts and opinions on them. And huge week this week, probably the biggest graphic thoughts video, so much so, let me pull out the pile of books that I'll be talking about. A lot to talk about this week, so I will get right to it. That was a lot heavier than I thought it would be. Some books I really like, some books I wasn't a huge fan of. I tend to rank these in like the least to the most, but this week with so many books, it's more of a random mixture of them. I'm starting with, pull out the first book here, which is Coyote Dog Girl by Lisa Hannawalt. And this is a story about a dog girl, Coyote Dog Girl, legitimately a coyote that is a female cowgirl, I guess, or at least the story opens and we see she's running away from people that are chasing her. We find out later in the story why that occurred, and without giving anything away, it has to do with some action she took because of the situation she was put in for her own safety, and now she's trying to get away from these people that are trying to legitimately hurt and murder her. And in her attempt to flee, she runs into some other I should say wolves, or in this case they were basically Native American amalgam or analog. And you would think with that kind of setup, running away from people trying to kill her, that would be more of a classic Western or thriller or something of that nature. But this is much more comedic. It certainly has its serious moments per se, which I think was one thing that was holding this book back for me. Was I felt like it was trying to get to something more substantial that it just never did. It's funny, it's humorous at times, it's effective in telling this pretty straightforward story. It's really a giant chase sequence that she's trying to get away from these people, and you learn a little bit about the backstory, and then that's pretty much it. On a narrative standpoint, it's as Westerns tend to be, it's not trying to rewrite the book, but the aesthetic itself is obviously much different than what you would expect. The art is simple and effective. Rarely is there more than one or two characters on the page. I think it uses the landscape of your classic Western pretty well. And on a storytelling standpoint, these characters are don't have a lot of range in facial animation, but I think it's for what the story it's trying to tell, it's done well, and with very not a lot of detail, but it's trying to get the most out of the least type of style, which may not work for everyone. But so I thought this was a well executed story. I thought it could have been a little bit more. It's a little light, a little lacking. And I don't know if there were things that simply were there that I was trying to pick up. Not that every story necessarily has to be this weighty story, but there were elements there. I think that if they were better told, or better executed when it got a little bit more serious, I think it sometimes would undercut itself by putting a joke that wasn't necessarily needed here and there. But outside of that, again, I would recommend reading it for sure. Probably one of the better books that I enjoyed is Phlox, and this is written by Elle Nichols. This is a picture of her as growing up in Louisiana, rural Louisiana. But actually, right now, Elle Nichols has transitioned into a man, and this is his life story, kind of a graphic memoir, but done with a little bit more style than your classic graphic memoirs. I actually talked about some others, and often with graphic memoirs, you tend to have pretty straightforward art styles. This is much, I think, creative with that. You see some of these actual mathematic equations. It's because going to school was a gift, not gifted, but we're in certain math schools that were kind of dedicated to high level math and MIT, things like that. So some of that stuff is thrown in, and there's probably a lot of math references that are well over my head, because I remember pretty much nothing outside of basic algebra from high school. But it's what the story is really getting to is a few things. Ultimately, going back to the title Phlox, it's about not just, I think, the story of Elle Nichols, but how the people around him or her as a child affected the way life was, and the good and the bad, and how the people growing up in a very religious church, or a family that went to church, very religious, against obviously homosexual lifestyles and things of that nature. She felt ostracized or afraid that she would be outed by people around her. and you have really great representation of that. You definitely feel the empathy. The emotion here is probably the strongest aspect of it. It's very raw. It kind of can seem repetitive at times because it's all, talking about that constant fear, but it's often, it's this person's life. It is how that fear was constant. It was always there from childhood to adolescence to high school to later. But also there's some benefits as well. This isn't something here that's like bashing religion or anything of that nature, because it even talks about things like when parents were divorced and how that flock was there to also provide assistance and help, and the downside and benefits of, how often we need that acceptance from others, but sometimes, you can feel the most like yourself when you're isolated and alone and away from everyone. So I thought it just was a very honest telling of this story that that I thought did it a very creative way of getting its point across and be able to represent kind of how he was feeling at the time, and that journey throughout, from start to childhood goes all the way up to probably relatively recently. I thought on the art I thought quite good. I like this content, using this ragdoll as a character stand-in. It had me thinking of something like, not saying it is as good as, but reminiscent of something like My Favorite Thing is Monsters, where the main character in that is represented by an actual looking monster, where everyone else looks the same. And it's the same thing here. Everyone else, for the most part, is drawn normally as a general human being. But again, getting to that point of being isolated from people around you and being scared to kind of express who you are. I thought by the end of it, I think it's hard. A graphic novel or graphic memoir is challenging to kind of review. Ultimately, you're commenting on someone's life. You can't say, well, this story choice or that story choice, because it's someone's life. But kind of looking at more so, what's the purpose of telling this story and what does it accomplish? And I think on this sense, looking at just the concept of flocks and not just the person itself, but the people around them, I thought was, and growing up in Louisiana and being in this small community and how isolated she was at life and not really being free, even knowing it was okay to accept himself, and how just being able to escape that, what that opened up, and this how flocks would change throughout life. I thought it's a pretty straightforward and quote unquote obvious idea, but I thought it was well told and well intertwined, and I think did a little bit more than your classic memoir because of that. And ultimately, like I said, I think what really makes it the strength is the creativity and just raw emotion that's throughout the book. So that's why I ended up kind of quite enjoying that by the end. I might sound like a simpleton for some people, but I've not read a lot of Kafka, or any, I should say. And this is Kafka-esque by Peter Cooper, I would assume. I'm not sure. But what this is Peter put in and redesigned or adapted a bunch of Kafka stories, about 14 different stories, and translated them, and then translated again into comic book form. And I think they're all pretty relatively short, only a few panels, covering a wide range of ideas and themes. Excuse me. But what I really enjoyed most about this was actually before we even got there. There is this few-page essay written by the author just about that process of what it was like to kind of make this book, and the process of adapting something and translating something, just the challenges that occur. We think translating a comic or a story from one language to the next, it's like you're just taking, what is this word in German, now bring it into English. How complicated that gets. Just like using the example they used here was something like the word trip, and determining like what word would you use? Do you use trip, or do you use voyage? Not only do you need to capture the word, but the tone, the sense of rhythm, the spacing, the style. There's a lot to go in just one word. So I found that interesting, just how that process would go, and just ultimately how you would not know for sure, because the person's not here to say, oh yeah, that's what I would have chose. But then adding to that, not only is this adapting it from one language to another language, you're also taking it from one medium to another medium. So doubling up on the complications of not only what words do you choose, but what do you translate into what, but what do you keep in, what do you let the art tell, and what do you let the words tell. So I felt like before the book even began, I felt that was actually quite interesting, and then going into the actual translation themselves. As someone who's not read a lot of Kafka, I cannot really critique it on how effective it was capturing the original spirit from the material it adapted. But I thought the stories themselves were well done. I liked the art style a lot. The black and white look to it for sure was really strong. Really inventive storytelling throughout the book. So I thought that was really great. It does make me too. I think if the purpose behind this is it's almost like a Cliff Note version of what Kafka has done, to then go off and actually read some original stuff by him as well. So it made me interested in doing that. I don't know if that will ever happen, just because it's my to read list, as you see here, is big enough as is. But I thought, in the sense of how comics can sometimes kind of open your eyes into other things, sometimes other people's lives that we talked about with some of the books, or in this case other authors or other creators from other mediums. So I benefited on that end. From Oni Press, I always say this name wrong because I feel like I'm saying it incorrectly, but it's called Archival Quality, which is, it does not necessarily roll off the tongue honestly as a title, but I actually really quite enjoyed this book. I will say that my biggest gripe, and it's going to be hard talking about this because it has to do with the ending of it, I was a little underwhelmed with how it finally concluded. But to get to that, what this is about, its main character, and although this isn't a true story, you can, based upon a lot of the author's notes, it's a lot of her life is in this, or at least you can tell there's a lot of personal, the author's working through or using her own life experiences in an effective manner. You have this woman who is recovering from an episode. She has had her own challenges in life, dealing with mental illness, but she's now trying to kind of move on with her life, or at least find a new path. It's starting with trying to get a new job, and she has people around her that support her, including her boyfriend, but just trying to find her own way. She's finds some trouble though because she doesn't have a degree, and she wants to work in libraries, a lot of which, in order to get a good job, you'll need a degree. But she finds this one place that will accept her, but it's a kind of a weird location. And what's really weird about this museum is that no one really goes to it. But somehow it remains open, and her job is really just going to the archives, getting things scanned, and she also has to live there as well. And then she learns, if you can't tell by the cover, that the place is haunted, and we discover that this is the museum sits on the ground that was once a mental institution. And I think what this does a really effective job at is kind of looking at the way we treated the most vulnerable in the past. The way that mentally ill were basically tortured not too long ago, and how a lot of that is still lingering today, and connecting it with someone who's having similar issues, or at least having their own struggles to deal with and work through, and how there's still challenges there, and how sometimes there may be more of a support structure. We're not putting people necessarily in hospitals like this, but a lot of that still remains, and a lot of the remnants are still there, and a lot of it's still not really been confronted, and people are still kind of benefiting from it in a way. And there's this mysterious board, and this is kind of where my issues come in, that play a big role in this. And there's this board that's like running this place that kind of keep things moving, and who they have to try to kind of answer to. And my issue is like that piece I felt like never came to a satisfying conclusion. It was more abstract. So when we got to the ending of it, there was almost like it needed some sort of true antagonist to kind of point a lot of this towards, because it felt well, you ended up with a point that maybe painted too many broad strokes, or you ended up with a conclusion that you didn't really feel the impact of, because you didn't know the people that it was really impacting. And I know that's very general. I don't want it necessarily, because it's the very end of the book. But that was the one thing that took things away. But what I thought it did effective, it had really strong characters. I thought the art style was well done. Obviously more cartoony. Very of reading a lot of Oni books, this feels very much in their style. This is not an all ages book. I think some people might see this style, think, oh, this is a book meant for kids. That's not the case. I do think anyone above, probably 14, 15 and above would enjoy it, but there's a lot more sophistication here. It's dealing with a lot. The relationship between her and her boyfriend, I thought, was really one of the best parts of this. And again, that's where I felt like you can tell some real life experience was pouring into this, where it didn't fit into the normal cliches of having someone who's struggling, and the conflict with her boyfriend. They're people who certainly care for one another, but it seems like for whatever reason they tend not to be. They were not healthy for one another in a way, and even though they tried to be. So that I thought was one of the more intriguing pieces of this book, along with just the concept of it. Yes, this is a ghost story. There's some horror bits of it, but it never, I think, ever attempts to be scary. I think it on that sense. If anything, it's more using the supernatural to evoke emotional responses in more empathetic manner rather than a horror manner, which is a little bit different. Which I think was a good idea, because often with haunted houses stories, you can get narratives that take a little bit too long to develop, and you have a lot of is it real, it's not, it goes back and forth, and it's not really happening, no one believes her. But I thought it dealt with that relatively quickly, and it got right into it very, very soon. So it didn't like have that really annoying pieces where it's like, is this real? Is it not? No, we don't believe you. You're crazy. It kind of went through all that and just focused more on solving that mystery. So minus the end that I wasn't super satisfied with, everything else I really enjoyed. Probably the book I enjoyed the most out of all the books I'll talk about, although it's a little bit unfair to compare, is the Divided Earth. This is by Faith Erin Hicks, with colors by Jody Belair. And it's not very often you see a colorist so predominantly put on the cover of a book, but it's deservingly so. This is the last piece of the Nameless City trilogy. I think the first one came out 2 years ago, or technically 3, and this is the final piece of that puzzle, of that narrative. I don't know if there'll be more. The way this ends, there could possibly be, but the Nameless City is this city that is this strategic point for a lot of these different nations, but no nation can necessarily hold it for very long. So it just has the rotating factions of leaders and countries that take it over, but then are conquered, and no one can hold on to it for so long, which is why it's called the Nameless City. But it seems like this is dealing with kind of, it's hard to talk about because this is, again, the second of the last of 2 previous books, but all the different characters are now, there is a threat of another nation coming in to conquer the nation that's there. There is this secret formula that's been discovered that is this major weapon that could turn the tide of war. But our main characters are trying to stop that from happening. And also dealing with the fact, a big piece of this is kind of the people that are stuck in the middle, people in that city as well, and how they're impacted. And by the end, I realized how many characters are really in this, and how strong their narratives were built throughout. I would say, though, like, when it comes to trilogies, this is really one extended story. You haven't, those series of books where each book feels like its own complete piece. That's not necessarily, I think, the case with this series. Outside of the first installment, these all kind of, like, this doesn't, like, you couldn't read this on its own, and I think enjoy it without reading the other two. And unlike, say, comparing it to something where, like, Star Wars, where each piece is its own complete story and movie that have continuing story bits that connect throughout. This is more something probably akin to Lord of the Rings, where it has a bunch of ongoing stories. It's just one really long epic story where you don't necessarily have each installment feeling it like its own complete piece. It's not necessarily one way is right or the other. It's just how you prefer it, I guess. But the art's really strong. So fantastic action. There's this continuing piece. There's a lot of movement within this action. A lot of this is just people running on rooftops, but it's always gorgeous to look at. And it's a really fun, strong book. It is an all ages title, which is fine. This is all ages. Comics have a lot of really strong all ages books. This has been one of the best the last few years. But it does approach some more difficult issues, and it doesn't necessarily shy away from that, which I think Faith Erin Hicks, who has, she's done a lot of comic book writing in general. I think she wrote Batgirl, I'm not mistaken, but this is by far the favorite thing that she's done that I've read, and I would highly recommend picking up this book for sure. If you have a kid, or if you, I love this myself. This is going to be one of my favorite books of the year. I'm not ashamed to admit it because, it's good. Let's move on to a book probably the one I liked least out of the one I liked the most, Cloud Hotel, but from Julian Henshaw. This is a really hard book to describe for a lot of reasons, but it's dealing with this town, and these kids are being abducted by what seems like UFOs, as you can see here. What's challenging with this, it deals with a story that it's hard to tell what's real, what's being imagined, because it flips-flop, because they don't get necessarily abducted by aliens per se. They get kind of taken to this other world, which is like, are these people pretending to look like humans in order to just, better communicate with us? And it goes back and forth throughout. You think, okay, we're back at Earth, but suddenly we're suddenly back in that world where they were abducted towards. So it's one of those where you don't know what's real and what's fake, and that just never works for me. Thinking of something like David Lynch, tonally it's very different, but like something like Mulholland Drive, where it's like working on dream logic, and scenes will cut in and come out from one location to the next. And on a craft standpoint, I can appreciate it, but on as simple as an experience standpoint, I just did not enjoy it. And because I need something tangible to kind of hold on to, and when you try to grab onto something, it's like, nope. I get so caught up with trying to understand what exactly is happening, I miss the story that's on the page sometimes. Again, that's completely a me issue, so I think there's a lot of people that probably would enjoy this, but for me, it just wasn't a story I did like the art. I thought it was strong, and like I said, on a craft standpoint, I can appreciate what they were trying to do, but by the end of it, I just was not enjoying my time reading it. A book I was really enjoying my time reading is Woman World, and this is by Emitter. I'm going to say the name wrong, so I apologize. I won't even attempt. But this was really funny. And this was actually, I think, originally published on Instagram. Now it's in book form. And it's about Woman World, where it's in the future. And what has happened is that men have become extinct because of genetic issues, that men were no longer being born. So they no longer exist. And the world's kind of went to hell for a little bit. But now it's just kind of run by women who are trying to make the best of what's happening and trying to pick up civilization from there. But it is really, outside the opening where it's like hell on earth, after that, it becomes rather fun. And what was really surprising by this, and you would think with that concept, like, oh, it's going to, sometimes there are those books that try to teach you a lesson with a capital L, which would be fine. I think there's certainly a framework to do that, thinking of something very different in every aspect of it, but Children of Men, that was a story about where babies stopped being born. But this was more, I think, a reflection of 21st century culture in a fun and humorous way, dealing with, basically how a lot of misinterpretations of what happened back in our day, like thinking, Paul Blart Mall Cop is someone to admire and love, and not knowing. I don't want to. Let's just say, like, coming up across certain things, thinking, oh, we found a factory of android men that were being developed, but realizing it's something completely different. I don't want to ruin a joke, but I thought it was really funny. You have things like the mayor is always naked just because she wants to be. It's never really a big deal. But I guess when everyone's the same gender, nudity might not matter. Dealing with some general political jokes, but I know some people are super sensitive when it comes to books that lean one way or another. And this never felt like it was social satire in a very light sense, considering the concept of it. But I enjoyed it throughout. You have a lot of different vignettes, it's usually 3 or 4 page stories, kind of bits and pieces, and then moves on to there's about 4 or 5 rotating main characters that we deal with, like a grandmother and her daughter, which is to me was the best part, was her, because she grew up in the 21st century trying to explain to her grandchild what exactly life was like and the challenges of it, and that was, to me, was one of the best parts of it. So this was really great. Like I said, I think it was originally on Instagram, and I think just compiled into one book. And hearing that, I think it would feel disjointed or like it shouldn't connect, but it actually does quite well. So highly recommend Woman World. Another book, this is from Humanoids. This is So it was from Jimmy Benham and Emil Bodot. I said those names wrong probably as well. It's Superman isn't Jewish, but I am kinda. This is Humanoids, which is a relatively newer publisher. If you may have heard, Mark Waid's actually coming on to work with Humanoid to try to create some sort of superhuman universe within that. This is not at all dealing with superheroes, despite the title. I don't know if that's going to work for Humanoids. Right now, what Humanoids is mostly doing is taking titles from Europe and translating them into English. They've done that with a few books, including this one. And this is, again, another graphic memoir story of someone growing up, this time in France, and kind of the struggle of growing up with a father who was Jewish and a mother who wasn't. And when they become separated, having to decide, am I Catholic, am I Jewish? And when I'm around a community that doesn't necessarily accept Jews, or at least in his eyes. And when I was reading this, I didn't know it was adapted from a French book. I thought this was just an American story, because I didn't just pick it up and started reading it. And it becomes important because a piece of this, no pun intended, was him growing up and concerned because he was circumcised, but no one else around him was, and worried that if he ever got involved with a girl, or people around him would find out that he's circumcised and different than everyone else, and that they find out he's Jewish, and people didn't know what it meant to be Jewish and what that would cause, because the kid that was people didn't know was Jewish was kind of made fun of. So what struck me was being isolated American. Being circumcised is kind of the norm. So I was like, why is that? That seems kind of odd. Maybe that was different back then. I know it's changed since then. In today's age, like that tradition's been dying off here and there, more and more. So I was like, that's kind of weird though, because he was growing up around the time, I think 76-ish. But then I realized, oh, it's France. That's why, because it doesn't, which I think is also telling, because how going back to the Kafkaesque book about adapting one book from one language to another, just how effortlessly this is translated into English. And I thought this was honestly from New York for most of it. I was like, oh, this is the way it was drawn, the way the characters interactions were. It felt like a big Jewish family you would find in parts of New York or something of that nature. But that wasn't the case, because they're in this big city. They're actually in France. But outside of that, the Superman is Jewish piece was because how he struggled with knowing should he be a Jew or should he not be, and really his relationship with his father, and how his father said it's good to be Jewish because of all these people that are Jewish, like Woody Allen and Steven Spielberg and Superman, who was created by Jews, which was the case. And so outside of that, it doesn't talk about Superman. So if you're picking this up thinking, oh, is this going to be a story about the creation of Superman and his creators, and how he's changed from this Jewish symbol of the fight against the Nazi propaganda of its day, to more of a Christ-like figure, especially after the Christopher Reeves films, and definitely with the Zack Snyder movies. That's not the case. That's kind of what I thought the book was going to be about, because I just picked it up and started reading. But again, it's more about his personal life and his personal journey. Again, on an art standpoint, it's more straightforward. Not a lot of backgrounds, not a lot of straightforward panels, just very similar. If reading a lot of Humanoids books, being able to read more European books is very in line with that type of style. But I thought it was well told. It was enjoyable to read, for sure. I don't think, in a sense of what it's able to convey in an emotional standpoint, was at the level of some of the other graphic novels I talked about, but it also wasn't dealing with, I think, as serious of issues, even though it is dealing with religion. But I thought, I did enjoy it. Again, a relatively quick read. They didn't make, one of the funniest pieces was, he drew his grandfather to look like Yoda, and then they showed photos at the back, and you're like, oh, he did really look kind of like Yoda. So I would recommend this. I've enjoyed pretty much everything I've read from Humanoids. This, Kabul, and Luciada from past or present. So they've been, I think, taking a lot of French titles and bringing them over. I don't know if that's going to change now, as Mark Waid's coming in and taking the lead. We'll see. All right, just two more books to go over. This one I don't have a lot to say about, but The Beatles' Yellow Submarine. And this is, again, adapting the Yellow Submarine original movie into a comic book. And I'm a Beatles fan. I didn't really. I appreciate Yellow Submarine, but it's, I think, beyond me a little bit. Maybe if I took more drugs, I would enjoy it. But it works very well for a comic book, actually, and not too surprisingly, gorgeous colors, very bright and cheery, gigantic panels. This is done by Titan Comics. So if you're a huge Beatles fan, I think you'll really like this. I don't know if people outside of that would really enjoy it all that much. It does actually have the Beatles. It's just, again, taking Yellow Submarine and adapting it pretty well, though. I thought the panels here were just super creative. It really gets that art style down super well. And it feels like it could have came out like that day. Like it could have came out right during that time frame. So I just found myself, like, sometimes even when the story is super wacky, the actual art here is fantastic to look at. So outside of that, if you're a Beatles purist or completist, you may want to check it out. All right, finally at the end, the last book, again, another graphic memoir. This case, it's RX by Rachel Lindsay. And this was, again, her story dealing, again, with mental illness. But the difference between this is that Rachel was actually working for the prescription industry growing up. Her job was actually, in a way, working for the prescription industry that dealt with mental illness and kind of looking at how they would try to advertise to people and the approaches that would take and how that was actually impacting her life herself. Like, she's bipolar, and her job is actually trying to construct work with this drug that is designed to basically be attractive or at least appealing to those that are suffering with similar issues to herself, and how that kind of weighed on her psyche. And again, similar to this, the relationship she has with her family, how she ends up having an episode and gets put into protective care, and she has to kind of play this game and trying to get out. And it's a good, I think, look at, just similar to geez, I talked about a lot of books. Similar to like Archival Quality that dealt with mental illness, just how we're still not really, I think, at the point where we are effectively, working with people that have mental illness, and we still don't understand it, and how people, like, family members would try to help, but maybe make things worse because they would commit her in her tumultuous relationship in a way. So I just thought it was, again, the art style maybe, again, a little bit more straightforward than Fox, but very creative designs here and there. A little bit more cartoony, but well told. Not many lines, just gets a lot out of a little bit more. It's a little more reminiscent of like classic comic strips, something like that. But I thought, similar to the other books, really effective read. I thought the idea, seeing it from that perspective of someone who actually is working with that industry and the problems it has, but the benefits it does as well, and being her personal story and how it fits into that, I thought that made it really effective. And it's, a huge topic of today, certainly, especially not only mental illness, but this prescription drugs and industry, and how it's, impacted everything, and seeing it from a personal perspective, through someone's own life. And again, very honest and very raw, but never, I would say, ever feels melodramatic. It can be funny in a dark sense, for sure. So I would definitely recommend pretty much this as well. It's a good look into what it's like to be in that scenario. It has to be super complex to deal with. But yeah, so a lot of books to talk about. I know I've rambled there at the end, but most of all the books I talked about, I would definitely recommend. My favorite being the Nameless City trilogy. Phlox and RX were probably the best out of the books I talked about for the most part. Some of the other ones were good. Yellow Submarine, if you're Beatles purist, Kafkaesque was a fun read, or at least a cool to look at for the process perspective of it. But if you've not noticed, I've not put out as many videos as recently. Unfortunately, my personal computer that I do most of my video editing on is dead, so I can only really do videos like this, where you can probably tell I don't really do any editing for. I just kind of shoot and talk. So hoping to get that fixed. It's been fixed and died, so we'll see. And I haven't really been getting physical comics anymore, so that's why I haven't been doing any comic book lots, because it would have been like, here are the 3 books I picked up, and I didn't think it was really worth talking about that sense. So putting more of my effort within these graphic novel reviews and discussions to really just show all the different books that are out there, just to let you know what's out there and what they're about. So as I mentioned, at the beginning of December, end of November, I'll be putting out my top 100 comics of 2018. I put a journal list together already to see where things would be, and 100 seems like a lot, but then when you start thinking about it, you realize like, books I thought would be my top 50 are now not possibly making it, because there's a lot of comics to read, and it's been a long year. I just did 10, 11 books here, and still have more to read. So, but also always looking for recommendations if there are books out there that you think need more recognition or kind of under the radar, aside from the the big 2 that we always hear about. Let me know. I'll definitely try to check them out if I can. All the books I talked about today were available at my personal public library. So if there's a book that you're interested in, highly advised, if you don't want to spend the money, either check your local comic book store or check out your local library, either through physical means or check if they have a Hoopla account or OneDrive or something like that. So take advantage of your libraries. It's super beneficial, especially for trying to be a comic book fan on a budget. All right, well, that's it for me. Just remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, thank you so much for watching.